Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to iNN's Headlines and Beyond. It's the weekend edition. It's edition week 50.3, 2014. And it's been an interesting week in the news, in which you'll find out that a lot of things are interlinked and that the news really doesn't move on to too much in terms of the underlying geopolitics. So let's get right into this here. We're going to look at something unusual, and this is a sort of say, many cases when you look at reports from Alex Jones or other so-called non-mainstream media, they're always talking about conspiracy theories. And this is a conspiracy, that's a conspiracy. They talk about New World Order, they talk about Illuminati, they talk about, some of them will talk about Jewish conspiracy and so on and so forth. And what I wanted to do is go into this and sort of pick beneath the surface. And I've been able to demonstrate, I'll be able to demonstrate that the view of a monolithic conspiracy doesn't exist. There is conspiracy, but it's not monolithic. It's not by one overarching group who controls everything, but rather it's a mishmash of different things. And oftentimes, that even when you have components that are working together in one conspiracy, they're actually working against each other in another. So this is kind of the way the world works. The geopolitics is about making and breaking alliances. So you'll have, on certain cases, you'll be on certain issues of mutual interest, you'll be working with your enemy. At the same time, on issues that are mutually opposed, you'll be fighting your enemy. So this is kind of the way it is. You sort of see this with the United States and Iran. Both now are battling ISIS, which is an American creation, and this is why, in many cases, this whole section here is called John McCain's Guide to Starting a War, because this is exactly how the United States goes about creating this type of war in order to further its own self-interest. In other words, the United States went from being the liberator of the world to fighting wars for its own economic interest. And its economic interest is to keep and create small dictatorships that rely on the American government heavily for its survival and existence. And in doing so, they set up these sort of false kingdoms. And it's called caliphates. We know one caliphate that the United States has set up is Saudi Arabia. Then there's also Kuwait, there's Qatar. There's a whole variety of caliphates that have been set up by the United States in order to keep control over particularly the oil resources. And ironically enough, just before the Civil War, as they call it now, broke out in Syria, you had a declaration that oil was found in Syria. So all of a sudden, right after oil was found in Syria, the report came out that oil was found in Syria, you had the beginning of the Syrian conflict. And this is the same time that Israel wanted to go in and bomb Iran. If you were watching the news at the time, you'd be hearing all about how Israel wanted to go in and bomb Iran, saying that, they were saying that Iran is close to having a nuclear weapon. There's all this whole thing about the nuclear disarmament of Iran. Bush wouldn't go in. George W. Bush wouldn't go in, and Obama said he wouldn't go in. But what ended up happening is, in the background, you saw everybody sort of line up on the Syrian border, and the battle for Iran began inside Syria. And who are the major players inside Syria? Well, Hezbollah is with Iran, and there's Shia, I should say. The Shia are Iran, and the Sunni are Arabs. They're and let's make it very clear here that the Shia, the Iranians, are not Arabs. They're Persians. So you have Persians on one side, you have the Arabs on the other side. The Arabs are supported and backed by the United States and Israel. and Iran is supported by, well, basically the Soviet Union or Russia now. And this is the old order during the Cold War. And as we've seen lately with the beginning of Iran, with the conflict in Ukraine, and again, they've termed it the conflict in Ukraine without specifying or acknowledging necessarily that the United States overthrew the elected government of Ukraine because it would no longer do what the United States wanted. So when they realized that the former president of Ukraine wasn't going to join the Euro alliance, he was beginning to realign with Russia. All of a sudden, he was a bad dictator. He was a bad leader. Convicted all these crimes. They falsified these crimes in court, and they used a legal means. This is the way Democrats do it. They use legal means to say, "Oh well, this guy is a criminal. We have to get him out. We have to remove him." In other words, they're talking about a coup, but they use illegal. They use the United States as the police of the world, and this is exactly what they did in Syria with Bashar. For a while there, he was all right, and then later on, when they no longer needed him, when they wanted the oil in there, all of a sudden Bashar was bad. They used these false stories in the media. Again, it was all this, it was the type of things you would see when they came up with these sort of false evidence against Iraq. The United States now has a history of creating these false flags, if you will, for their means of going to war. The Democrats will use a legalistic term, while the Republicans will use militaristic terms. So, just the way what happens, when the past, where the Republicans went to war, and the Democrats, and this is what happened in Korea and in Vietnam, they didn't go to war. It was a police action. And this is what happens. You'll see in both Vietnam and in Korea, which were led by the Democrats. You see the involvement of the UN. You see a lot of UN resolutions against Korea and Vietnam, against the North, calling them all these, that these people are bad. You can't, And what they're doing is that they were creating the narrative, and this is why Korea and Vietnam was fought, is that they were fighting to support European colonialism. The government in the South was loyal and basically a puppet regime of the West, and the North was a breakaway government who didn't want to be a puppet. They wanted to be independent of the West. And of course, because there was no one around, no other power around, and the Western powers wouldn't accept them, they ended up in the Soviet sphere. So they were easily able to come back. The West was able to come back. Well, this is a Soviet threat. They came back with a so-called domino theory, that if they allowed Korea and Vietnam to fall, that these would be dominoes and that the West would be next. And so they created the narrative for war. And this is exactly what's going on now, is that in Syria, is that in Ukraine, the narrative for war is being built. Built with some degree of success. There's still a lot of dissent, a lot of mistrust with the governments now, because the government's been lying to us so often. As a matter of fact, the government lies to us enough that one would actually say by observation that the government now is a habitual liar. And there's no way that you can actually trust what the government actually says is it to be true, even when they are indeed telling the truth. There's no way to tell if they're telling the truth, even if they are telling the truth, because they lie so often that you just can't trust it anymore. And the thing is you see Al Jazeera, and you go, oh, Al Jazeera is now an Arab paper, right? We should get something more, less biased, because it's not because the Jewish-controlled media. And this is sort of the view of some of the conspiracy theories, that the media is controlled by these elite groups. Some call it Illuminati, some call it the Jewish conspiracy. There are a variety of different groups who are all controlling the group. And when you question people about the conspiracy theories, about well, is it the Illuminati or the Jews or the Masons or so on and so forth, they say, well, it's all of them. Because they say the Jews are the Masons, they're also the Illuminati, they're in charge of everything. And that's when you start getting into these wild views that there's something larger going on, that and it's being controlled by this one monolithic group. This is what they often called the New World Order, and who actually runs the New World Order is never actually discussed, and they don't give you an idea of who's running the New World Order. They simply they're these sort of unknown groups, if you will, that are running everything. But again, you have a hard time sort of picking them out, and when you start looking at things, the conspiracy theory starts to fall apart because you don't see this monolithic group. What you do see is geopolitics is the way it normally is it's a lot of fractured groups, people who have power, and they're all fractured into a variety of different groups, and they're battling for control. And that's exactly what's happening in geopolitics. These are not people who work well with each other. These are all sharks, and they're all in one shark tank, and they're fighting with each other for control. And this is kind of what is going on. This is sort of a continuation of what's going on. And so when you see, this week we're fighting continuing in Aleppo in Syria, Al Jazeera is calling ISIS the Free Syrian Army still. Well, you go and say, well, who is Al Jazeera? You realize that they're Qataris. That this is from Qatar. You go into Qatar and see, well, who are the people from Qatar? Well, they're royalty, and they still to this day maintain slaves. So they live well, but the slaves who do their serving and do their bidding live poorly. Anyways, when we come back in the next segment, we will talk more about this. We'll get into some more of the headlines, and we'll go in and show how a lot of the stuff within the headlines, how it fits within this whole concept of geopolitics and the evolution of geopolitics.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Welcome back, everybody. Took a bit of a break. One of the things where nature calls, and well, you have to answer. So, where were we? We were talking about the reports in Al Jazeera about they're going to call them the Free Syrian Army, which is basically ISIS. Still funding in Aleppo. There's still a lot of battles going on in Aleppo. A lot of these things don't make the mainstream news. You don't find them on Fox. You don't find them on CNN. They're not part of the everyday headlines in the United States. The United States seems to sort of pick a topic for a while, move on to something else, and the view is, from the American point of view, that, and this is true even in North America, that when something goes away in the news, that the issue is more or less resolved, that things aren't still going on, and that's not the case. It's that the media has simply lost interest, so the fighting's still going on. The atrocities are still going on. It just the media has sort of lost focus in it, and they've lost their interest, and they're on to something new now. And the big thing now is Ferguson. And the thing is if you look at Ferguson in a very careful light, and you sort of detach yourself from all the hype and the hysteria going on, what you see is, and all you have to do is go onto Google. And actually, better place is going to YouTube. Go onto YouTube and Google police abuse. And once you look up police abuse on YouTube, and what you'll see not just white, not just black, but white, black, and everything in between. People of all colors, and you can't pick up one group above the other, talking about police abuse. And there's tons of videos on YouTube about police abuse. In every single case, the police gets away with it. And the excuse is the police need these powers in order to control society. Wait a minute here. Control society or fight crime? Because that's what the police were not there to control society. They were there to protect us. They were there as our security. And what we see here is that the police now have become just like organized crime. They're there in terms of a protection racket. They're there to control us. They're make sure that we fall in line and that we behave as good citizens. And it's not about protection from violence. It's now about something more. It's about control. And we see this in Qatar. We see this in Bahrain. We see this in Saudi Arabia. We see all these abuses by the police in there. And I think you see police abuse all over. And when you go back and I say, well, how do you explain this all? You go back to the 1970s experiment done by Dr. Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University, and it's become an infamous experiment now, where he took two groups of students. One would be and set them in what we call a fake prison. They create in the basement of Stanford University. They created a fake prison. It looked very fake, but they set the conditions up. They took two groups of students, chosen at random. One were the police, one were the guards, and one were the prisoners. And Philip Zimbardo presided over the prison as a warden. What ended up happening? Within 3 days, the guards became abusive. Prisoners started having mental collapses. They started having mental breakdowns. One or two students had to be hospitalized. And it took someone from the outside, another researcher from the outside, to come in and literally shake Philip Zimbardo, take him by the lapel and say, "Hey, what's going on? Do you understand what's happening inside your own prison? Do you understand this what's happening inside your own experience? It's gotten out of control. There are 3 students in the hospital right now." It is not until someone intervened from the outside that the project actually started. In other words, the psychologist who worked on this project, Philip Zimbardo, who put himself inside the project, could not see what was going on. And this is sort of the problem we have now with the police. The people on the inside, the part of the system, will never see what's going on. It takes someone from the outside to say, "Hey, stop it. This is wrong." And it's not about race. It's about the abuse of power, the abuse of the police system. This is the whole thing behind Ferguson, but it's not what you see in the media. Why? Because you have a battle between left and right. These are socialists on the left and socialists on the right. And this is what we see in Hong Kong. This week in Hong Kong, they had the breakup of the protests for the Occupy Hong Kong protests. We had, I think last year and the year before, we had Occupy Toronto, we had Occupy New York, we had Occupy Wall Street. Now, we had a number of these sort of Occupy movements. And I think even on the freeways, we've had this now. And what we see here is we see groups of leftists going out and using anarchy as a means of control. And they say, well, this is all peaceful protesting and this is our right to be civil disobedient. Well, this is not peaceful protest. Peaceful protest is you do create a crowd and you stand on the side and you can shout and scream and do whatever you want, but in sort of whatever you want, but you can't intimidate the other person. So if you're blocking a highway, where you're blocking someone who is not part of this from doing whatever they want to do in terms of their daily life, then you're not peacefully protesting. You're now intimidating. You're now using mob as a weapon, using the mob as a weapon. This is a way to force people to your ideals, to force people to your narrative. This is not peaceful protest, and this is not the whole purpose of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is, again, it's supposed to be done peacefully. It's not supposed to be intimidating, and it's not supposed to be done to shove your ideas down somebody else's throat. You can offer people your opinion, and it's up to the person to whether they accept it or not. I mean, part of being in a free society is that, yeah, I agree with it, and I agree and will argue and defend a person's right to say whatever they want to say, even if I don't agree with it. But this isn't what we're seeing here. What we're seeing, this is what we saw in Greece here. In Greece, you see the anarchists out there, these brainwashed anarchists working for the communists. Again, on the left, communism is on the left, and so you have what's going on in Europe, the nationalist issues, this whole thing about immigration. These are Nazis on the right. Nazis are also socialists, and the thing is, their issue is all about nationalism. When you hear about this patriotic stuff about, oh, our country, we can't have illegal immigration, these illegal immigrants are the cause of all our problems. That is not true. What you're hearing is Nazism. That's the Nazi narrative. And this is exactly what you hear out of the Republicans on immigration, is you hear a Nazi issue. And of course the left will take it up and they'll present their own issue, but they're not going to present a free issue. They're going to present a leftist issue. which again will end up leading to government enslavement. Both sides, left and right, communist and nationalism, your Nazi parties, will lead to a dictatorship. That's where they always have been. Historically, they lead to dictatorship. They don't lead to freedom. They use a lot of rhetoric and sort of independent narratives to bring apart, to sell their ideas. But what's really behind the ideas is enslavement on both sides. So it doesn't matter whether you're going left or you're going right. Both sides have the brainwashed anarchists. Both sides will use peace and security as their rhetoric. But the reality behind both of them is dictatorship. It's totalitarianism. It is loss of freedom. And they try to migrate society from one side to the other. And this is actually what we saw in Israel, and we're actually been seeing in Israel, is we're really seeing a steady move to the right. Of course, the left, when you start seeing something like this, they'll stand up and they'll start saying something. And the thing is that what we see now in Israel is we saw, if you look at the Israeli journal Haaretz, and I think you go from Haaretz and you go to, there are several other journals that you can go to, on online sources from Israel, to find out that and this is where you can sort of start peeling back this whole concept of the Jewish conspiracy theory, is you'll find that there's a lot of different views on what should be happening in Israel. There's not a common view, that there is a left-right narrative, but you also have groups who aren't necessarily left or right, and stand in neither left or right place. Right? And the thing is, some of these things they have one of the opposition party that is sort of joined together. Right? There's sort of two opposition parties on the left have joined together to fight Benjamin Netanyahu, who's they call him Bibi. Bibi is on the right. He's Likud, and they call him a Likudnik. Which is ironically Russian, instead of using a Yiddish term, they're using Likudnik, which is essentially a Russian term. But the thing is, Likudnik and Bibi are essentially Nazis. They believe in, and this is well within their Jewish nation-state law, that that Jews are superior to everybody else. When it was pushed on a talk show on TV Ontario in Canada, and it's called TVO, there is a show called Agenda with Stephen Paikin, and he had several Israelis on talking about the whole Palestinian issue. And the thing is that the show, he tried to balance the show up, but the show wasn't balanced at all. The part of the problem was the people that he chose. He had to, because in many cases Ontario is very, even though it's liberal, it supports Israel very highly. There's a sort of, in Ontario, there's an unquestioned support for Israel. And this, now let me make a proper definition of this to qualify the argument here. A unqualified support for Israel doesn't necessarily mean that they're supporting the Israeli people. What it does mean, it means that they're supporting the Israeli policy. In other words, they're associating Israeli policy, Israeli politics, and the policies coming out of the Israeli government as Israel itself. Now, there needs to be a separation of the two. There needs to be a separation, that the idea that no, Israeli policy is not Israel. Israeli policy is what it is. It's politics. It's policy. And that you are free in a free society to oppose policy. And yes, I disagree with racism. Yes, I disagree with, designing policy on racism. The fact of the matter is, this is actually what's going on in Israel. And when all sides are pinned down to say whether or not Israel should become a secular, non-denominational, non-national society, all sides said no. In other words, they were saying is that Israel should keep its Jewish identity, and that the Palestinians should be given a place inside of that Jewish identity. In other words, not the Jewish identity itself, but something below the Jewish identity. In other words, all sides agreed that the Palestinians should not have equality with Jews. And there you see on both sides, left and right, because that was represented on the panel there. And one of the panelists was a professor from University of Waterloo. Her father, I think, was Palestinian, and her mother was Jewish. So she did have a Palestinian side to her. She did not and could not agree to have an equal society where Jews and everybody else were equal. What she wanted was a Jewish society and then the Palestinian society within the Jewish society, but that you have to afford them equal rights. But the thing is, if you're not equal to somebody else, if you're with a subsection of that society, then you're not equal. You can call them equal. You can put a lot of rhetoric in there and say, "Oh, yes, they're equal to everybody," but unless they are actually equal, unless it's not Israel for the Jews, but Israel for everybody. Israel for democracy, Israel for freedom. Then you don't have a free Israel. You have an occupied Israel. You have an apartheid Israel. You have a Nazi Israel, where nationality matters. And the thing is, if you're an independent like I am, I'm an independent, then it's not about nationality. It's not about what group you identify with. It's about individual freedom. And the thing is, this did not come up. They could not agree to individual freedom on the panel here. They all, in their own ways, even though they were arguing both sides of the argument on what should happen in the Palestinian peace process, they couldn't agree that Israel should be a non-apartheid state. They all agreed that Israel would become an apartheid state, that there would be a Jewish state, and there would somehow be the Palestinian existence within that Jewish state. Anyways, when we come back, we'll continue talking about this because the Israeli election is coming up. It's in March 2015, and that's where everything is heading. Everything right now is about election. This is politicking for the election, and we're going to see how all these things sort of play out, because we in the United States have an election coming up in Ontario. In Canada, we have an election coming up in October 2015 as well. So a lot of stuff is playing towards the election cycle, and so we'll see how everything ends up turning out. See you on the other side of the break.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We're talking about what's going on in Israel, and I said everybody more or less is going towards an election. Even the United States, even though 2015 is not going to be an election year, what's happening is the way the American politics works out is that the politicking for the 2016 presidential elections is already in full swing. They're already pushing the boundaries. And a lot of what's going to happen now has to do with this type of politicking. And as I said, what's happening right now is, in Israel, is in many ways a sort of a narrative that we can sort of use to look at the United States and see what's happening in the U.S. Because Israel is a very powerful force in the United States. The APAC, American-Israeli Political Affairs Committee, or Political Action Committee, is a very powerful committee. They have a lot of influence over politicians in terms of what politicians do and how they vote, in terms of they're voting on various different bills. And the thing is that AIPAC does not represent the Israeli public. It represents only one section of the Israeli public, and that's the Israeli right. And that's essentially the Israeli Nazi Party. And I'm going to call Likud the Nazi Party because that's exactly what they are. I mean, there's no need to sort of nice coat this and sort of say, well, Likud is Likud. They're not necessarily Nazis. Well, they are Nazis. If you act like a Nazi and behave like a Nazi, then you're a Nazi. That's as far as it goes. This is the same thing is true for not all of the Republican Party, but a good chunk of the Republican Party, if you're anti illegal immigrant, then you're a Nazi. And the reason is that if you sit down and actually take a look at what's going on with the illegal immigrant, and this is where the Republicans are really idiots. They don't seem to understand that most of the illegal immigrants coming through are family-oriented, they're family conservative, they're Christian, and they don't want to be part of a union. They want to be part of their own independent contracting work. They want to be small business people. They want to be business people. They're interested in buying part of society. They want to buy their way into the United States. Well, this is exactly what Republicans are supposed to believe in. In other words, the fiscally conservative Republicans, the business Republicans. And this is where Ronald Reagan was. It's about business. If you want to come into the United States and you have enough money to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, in other words, if you were independent, then you were welcome. This is the Republican ideal. But this is no longer the Republican ideal. The Republican ideal, for those who call themselves Reagan Republicans, and these are primarily these neocons, they're fundamentally Nazis because they believe in American nationalism that isn't realistic, that never occurred. And so what happens, they define people illegal and illegal based on this whole concept of American nationalism. Well, that's what Nazism is. And they call themselves socially conservative. Well, if you're socially conservative, then you are a socialist. And just because you're not on the left and a communist, well, and if you're on the right and you're a nationalist, well, then you're a Nazi. That's by definition. And so people are asking, the question comes up, and I saw this on one of the Republican blogs. Well, who then do you vote for? And my argument is, well, vote for Republican. Well, why? If you're an activist, you really are an activist, and you want to actually get something done, Republicans, even though they're on the right, are famous for underfunding things. They want small government, they don't want to pay a lot in taxes, and that means you can't fund a lot of different programs. So a lot of these programs they have on the left get shut down. The programs on the left, on Democrats, will come in and they want all agencies. So if you're an activist and you want to go in and you want to set up a food kitchen, this is what's happened in Ontario here, you want to set up a food kitchen. Well, the Democrats, the Liberals, will set up enough regulations to guarantee that any private food kitchen, and this is what happened in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale, any private food kitchen is now illegal and you cannot feed the homeless. And they'll put enough regulations in there to stop you from doing this. Why? Because they want all government, or they want government people to be in there. They want their own government agencies to be in. That's how when the Democrats and Liberals talk about employment, they talk about creating jobs. They're talking about creating government jobs. They're talking about turning the United States and the world into Greece, where everybody's on the government payroll. The problem is, you see what's happening in Greece. If everybody's on the government payroll, who pays for the government payroll? There are no rich people. If everybody's on the government payroll, you have no private industry. Where do you get your income from to pay for everything you want to do? And this is what's happening in Europe. Europe is in the midst of another financial collapse. Their financial system is going haywire. And why? Because everything was put on the government dime, and now there's no one left to pay the bills. This is if you sit down and read the OECD reports, sit down and look at what's actually going on, and we will do this in documentaries to come. We will look at what's actually happening inside the European economics and show that it was right from the beginning a dead end. The collapse that Europe is experiencing now economically was and is predictable. Yet social left governments like Obama, Kathleen Wynne, the NDP governments, they don't seem to understand this. They seem to think, oh yeah, there's free money out there. There is no free money out there. Nobody has a magic pot of gold. And at some point in time, you're going to have to pay these bills. And unfortunately, if you don't have any income, when it comes time to pay the bills, the reality is you don't have income to pay the bills. And this is what's happening in Greece now, and this is what's happening in the rest of Europe. Greece is paying off its debt by getting more debt. You know, you have a debt that you can't pay. You go to another bank and get another loan, and you pay the debt off of that loan. But the problem is, if you're paying debt off of loan, At what point in time do you actually start paying off all the debts? The answer is you never do, because you don't have any income. All you're doing is getting more loans. And again, this whole concept of not paying loans with loans, if you're paying loans with a loan, and you don't have any real income, then you can't pay off that debt ever. This seems to be lost on the social left. Most socialists don't seem to understand this. Yeah, and then this is true for Obama. This is true for Kathleen Wynne. This is true for the governments in BC. This is true for most of the governments in Europe. And so what happens is that you have in Europe right now, you have a lot of Nazi parties looking very attractive because they're talking about fixing the problem. But if you understand that the Nazis on the right are essentially the same socialists that are on the left, they have the same policies because everything has to be run by the government. Well, then you're in the same problem. How do you pay off your debts? Well, you don't on the social right. Social right believes in slavery. You have slaves at the bottom and people at the top. This is what they believe in. They believe in the sort of hierarchical structure of society. That people are born into various different positions. People who are in low, they're in the trade. They belong to a trade union, but that's where they're born. That's where they're going to stay. They're never going to get above there. And you're born into your position. This is something that's genetic. And this is why Watson actually lost his Nobel Peace Prize. This is why he was sort of kicked out. Because Watson and Crick, the people who discovered the DNA, they were Nazis. They believed in this eugenics. They believed in a genetically based society. This was their belief. And I think as you see this popping up in Israel now, you see that on the Israeli side, you see a sign that says, well, Jews are superior to everybody else, and that everybody else left is Goyim, and the Goyim, according to kosher laws, are untouchable. Just the way you have in Indian society, you have the Dalits, or they call them the Dalits, right? D-A-L-I-T, Dalit. If you look at those, the untouchables, they're a part of Indian society that people can't touch. According to the Indian caste system, and the gods will smile on you or frown on you. People at the top have good karma. People at the bottom have bad karma, and you're there because you're in these different castes and these different karma levels because of the bad things you did or good things you did in the past life. This is the basis of reincarnation. So whatever you do to the people at the bottom doesn't really matter because, well, they have bad karma and they deserve what they're getting. The Calvinists have the exact same point of view, and this is why the Calvinists wound up being the slave traders. They believed they weren't doing anything wrong because the Calvinists believed that if you were wealthy, that you had a caste society, that if you were wealthy and were well off, you were a noble person, that God was smiling on you and because you were rich and wealthy, and that you deserved to have whatever you wanted to have on earth because you've now made it. God's smiling on it. So it doesn't matter what you did to the lower person because the lower person, they were cursed by God. This was God's plan. This was God's vengeance. And they were being punished by God and that you could do anything you wanted. And this is the same thing. This is why it was okay to go trade in African slavery. They were heathens. They weren't Christians. They were pagans. And they deserved whatever they got because, well, they weren't high caste. And the thing is that when they went into Africa, they didn't go in and walk in and take African slaves. They were dealing with African nobility, the tribes leaders, and there were African. If you go look into African history, you'll find that African history is a lot different than you would expect from what you see in the textbooks. They had nobility, they had castles, they had civilized societies in Africa, and these civilized societies had a caste system, just the way all societies in many cases had a caste system. And the slaves were purchased, again, the slaves that were purchased in Africa were the low people. They weren't the high people. There were high people in Africa, and there were low people in Africa. It wasn't the high people who were traded into slavery in Africa. It was the low people who were traded into slavery. And they were done so by high people in Africa. So it wasn't necessarily a race thing. It was more of a high-low thing. If you were born high, you were free. If you were born low, you were born into slavery and servitude. And this is the way slavery works. And this is sort of the exact same thing that happens here in Israel. And the thing is, what happens, the left doesn't understand this, and the right doesn't understand it. But you have you see some of the structure with the Israeli left. Who is with the Israeli left? The media establishment, right? So when they talk about the media establishment, they're talking about Disney, they're talking about Nickelodeon, most of your major media, they're all Israeli left, and so they'll push the left issues, and of course there's no misunderstanding that a lot of the leftist groups come out of the universities. So it's also no surprise that you have academic associations like the American Anthropological Association voting to boycott Israel, right? Because now there's a boycott Israel thing going on, and so they had a vote on that. And who else was also voted on this thing here? You had the American Studies Association endorsed the academic boycott from their college there. Then you had a group, and this is the telling part here. You had the Jewish Student Union at Berkeley voting to join the Israeli boycott. So it's not only you're having general people across society now in the United States starting to boycott Israel because of its move to the right, its Nazi stance, but you have people from even Jewish groups starting to do this boycott as well. And this sort of popped up in Haaretz as well. Again, none of this stuff, the boycott Israel, ever showed up in North American papers or even in Europe. This is from Israeli sources here, of what's actually happening in the diversity of Jewish opinion as to what's going on in Israel. It is very much a diverse thing here, and so you have, and because one of the groups they ended up banning from their union was this students organization called J Street, which is a Israeli right student organization. Again, you have these organizations. You're typically student left. They're usually social left, but you also have social right groups as well in the university as well. And more often than not, they battle back and forth for control of various different issues and various different areas in terms of who belongs to who and who can join in what, who gets funded for what. And we saw this before with the student group at Virginia Tech, who lost their funding because they had former Secretary of State Buchanan, I think, Buchanan speaking. They had Herman Cain's. In other words, they had a number of Republican speakers coming into their groups and speaking, and so the Republican Party, the student group, lost funding because the left group, who was in control of the student council, said you can't have any more funding because they didn't want to support any of the stuff that's on the right, or supposedly on the right, at least the Republican anyway. So. When we come back, we're going to go into our third segment here, and we're going to go into a lot of the how this plays out around the world and how the different dynamics come into global issues that we see in the news. All right, so when we come back on the other side.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Alright everybody, welcome back on the other side of things. We want to wait for a bit of a break. As I said, the left-right narrative is stitched throughout the entire narrative on the geopolitical scene here. And the thing is, Israel is involved in a lot of areas, and Israel does get involved in a lot of areas because Israel, in many cases, likes to hedge. So it's not that they believe in one side or the other, but the way they end up working on, this is the way hedge funds work. Rather than betting on one group to win, what you do is you spread your interests out amongst all the different groups. And whoever group wins, you start working favors with them. In other words, you start working in so that you can start getting your own particular issues out there. and dealt with. And this is a thing of interest. It's not necessary that the Israeli groups believe with all these different things. It has nothing to do with that. They have their own things that they believe in. And what they are interested in is they're interested in fulfilling their own mutual interests. Their own self-interest, I should say. And they achieve this. They achieve their own self-interest by making sure they're always on the winning side. And you can't, there's no way to predict whose side's going to win, so you get in on both sides. And you work your way the best you can to get the most of both sides. This is what happened during the Cold War. This is why, wondering why you have the name Rosenberg and two Jews going to the electric chair being executed for passing the atomic materials from the atomic bomb, plans for the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. Well, why did that happen? And how did it happen? Well, it happened through Israel. Israel is the one who gave the Soviet Union the atomic bomb. Well, why? Because they needed to play the Soviet Union off the United States in order to gain what Israel wanted to gain. And it was in Israel's interest, self-interest, to have the Soviet Union and the United States being equal players. So it put pressures on some of its groups who were on the left side of the United States, because there were left-right groups in the United States, even as far back as 1945. Actually, there were left-right groups all the way back to 1900s. There were left-right groups in the United States. And again, you had Jews on both sides of the issue. And the thing is, the Jews who were on the left were not necessarily religious Jews, and so they weren't fundamentally Jewish in terms of the religious aspect of things. But they were Jewish in terms of they were, they came from Jewish backgrounds, but they were now atheist, and so they supported the left. And so it didn't take much in 1945 and 1946 to have one of the leftist Jewish groups pass information to the Soviets as to how to build an atomic bomb. Not necessarily that the Soviets didn't necessarily know how to make an atomic bomb, but they nonetheless the information was passed on, and two people got the blame for it. And I say my suspicion is when you're looking at something like the Soviet atomic bomb project, and just two people get the blame for the whole thing, there's something more going on behind the scenes that you don't see. That these two people were given up as a sacrificial lamb, if you will, and they were sort of burnt at the stake. They were the token punishment for a whole group of people who were working or involved in this. So the same thing here is that now we're seeing that Putin was in India for talks. We know about, if you know about BRIC, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China. They've now all aligned economically for the oil thing, and of course you know what's happening now because of Ukraine. The United States and Europe has put a ban on Russia, and sort of course the United States is trying to sort of break up everything and try to keep control of stuff. But in other words, the United States is fighting for its own self-control here. And the thing is that what we got to remember here is that the ISIS is very much American here, and one of the things that you have to go back and look at some of the research. You have to go back in your research. You have to go back to earlier dates in history to find out what's going on. And I didn't have to go that far back. I just had to go back to November. Let's see what they were talking about in November with ISIS. And it says, after seizing large swaths of Iraq and Syrian territory, earlier this year, the Islamic State group proclaimed a caliphate on lands under its control. It also sought to implement its harsh implementation of Islamic law or Sharia law. And the thing is, what happened? The head al-Baghdadi proclaimed himself caliph. And remember I said before that the United States was looking to create these small caliphs, looking to create these small dictatorships, because these small dictatorships would depend on the United States for their survival economically and politically. Well, this is what's happening here. This is exactly what's happening. You're seeing ISIS, who are and were the Free Syrian Army, creating a caliph. And who are these caliphs? Who are they? Well, they're Sunnis. They're related, and the Sunnis, as you know, are related to the Saudis. They're Arabs. And they're in there, and why they? Because a lot of people get confused. Well, if we're supposed to be fighting Hezbollah, why are we supporting Al Qaeda and ISIS in Iraq and in Syria? Simple, because they're Sunni. You're fighting Hezbollah because they're Iran, and you're supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda because they're Arab. Let me say I made a mistake. I made a mistake here. I think, anyways. Hezbollah is Shia, and that's Iranian, and ISIS and Al Qaeda are Sunni, and they're Arabs. If you want to fight a Shia or an Iranian enemy, in other words, you want to fight an Iranian enemy, you support the Sunni terrorists like Al Qaeda and ISIS, and they do the fighting for you against the Shia. This is exactly the same thing that happened in the Iran-Iraq war. And the thing is, in many cases, to keep these groups fighting with each other, and this is what you'll find if you go back and look at Iran-Contra, go up and do a Google search on Iran-Contra, you'll find back in the 80s that Ronald Reagan, this is the whole thing with Oliver North, that Ronald Reagan with Israel and the United States were trading weapons to both Iran and Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. In other words, when Israel, when the Arabs and when the Islamists are fighting with each other, Israel and the United States benefit. In other words, if the Arabs and the Muslims are killing each other and they're wiping out the Middle East, this is good for Israel and the United States. And so basically, you have ISIS, you have Hezbollah, you have Hamas, you have Al Qaeda. When they do all these different things around the world, these called terrorist acts, this is actually good for the United States and in Israel. It benefits them. I mean, in terms of military terms, there is, if many people know about false flags, you also know about collateral damage. Collateral damage is the number of people killed, innocent people killed in an operation, not determines whether or not a military operation was successful or not. If you have an acceptable number of people killed in an operation, below a certain number of people killed, let's say 10%, then you're doing well. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be. It doesn't have to be in comparison to the total war. It can be in comparison to wars before. In other words, let's say you had, in one war you had 1 million people killed, but in the second war you have only 300,000 people being killed. Well, then that war is worth it. The second war is worth it because you're now below the 1 million threshold. In other words, you're improving. In terms of your kill statistics, you call the bean count and the collateral damage, you're improving. And so strategically, the war is worth it. What happens here is, and this is what we see in this recent war with Islam, and that's what it is, a war against Islam. They find that this so-called war, which is basically a false flag, is worth the number of people killed. Even 9/11 falls well within the collateral damage. So you have a number of people on this American and Israeli side who benefited, a good number of people who benefited from 9/11. And this is where you get all the conspiracy theories saying that the United States was involved in it, because they start seeing that, hey, wait a minute here, something doesn't necessarily smell right. And what they don't understand is that 9/11, as bad as it was well below the collateral damage level. Well below the collateral damage level. And so strategically speaking, 9/11 was worth its weight in terms of what they gained strategically. And in terms of the geopolitics, the geopolitical game, it was worth it. And so what we see here, we see, again, the United States involved in terrorism. And so what happens is that we know ISIS is spreading around the world. So we have here, Putin was first in talks for India. They announced a whole bunch of deals. Washington pops up, and this is from the Indian news, media. It says the United States on Thursday expressed disapproval of India concluding defense and nuclear talks with Russia, right? And deals with Russia, saying it's not time for business as usual with Moscow, in the backdrop of its Ukrainian aggression. In other words, the United States overthrew the Ukrainian government, but it's not the United States that's the aggressor. It's Russia who's the aggressor, right? So the United States is turning the tables and calling the defender the aggressor. So someone comes into your house, a burglar comes into your house, you defend your property and end up killing the intruder. The police come to you and say, the bad guy isn't the intruder, you're the intruder, you're the aggressor, and takes you off to jail. This is what's going on here, geopolitically speaking. And of course, they have Washington talking about how it's disapproval of India, including talks with the business leaders from Crimea, that this shouldn't be happening, this is a bad thing to be happening. And then right on its heels, there's a report. There's a report because in January 25th, Obama's coming to visit. Right on its heels here, you have Russian leaders' engagement in New Delhi, particularly a company of Sergei. Oh, okay, no, this is the wrong thing here. Wrong thing. Again, they're talking about the meeting again here, but it. Sorry about this. You get tongue-tied sometimes, particularly if you read the wrong here. At the same time, this happens here. If you look back to the Mumbai attacks of Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they say that these were attached to Pakistan, and no one knew how they got there. But the same thing was happening, is that the United States was in the area. They wanted to give India a lesson to say that India should be part of the thing, and all of a sudden you have these attacks. Once again, Obama is going to be in India. What happens? News from Lashkar-e-Taiba pops up again and says, they call him LET, Lashkar-e-Taiba, keen to revive militancy in the area. And this is a warning coming from the CIA just at the same time, saying that India should watch out because you have an growth of the LET, because now LET is now looking to join up with ISIS. And this is the report that came out of it. So right on the heels of the United States saying, hey, don't do deals with Russia, do deals with the United States, all of a sudden now the terrorist group LET pops up in India, and now you have warnings to the Indian government to be wary of terrorist attacks on its territory. And of course, if you read in the Indian Times, you read in the Indian news, the events, the terrorist events are picking up not only in Afghanistan, but they're picking up in the Kashmiri region as well. So it can be very well seen that the United States is definitely involved with LET. They're using LET as a way of pushing its diplomatic needs. So basically, what we could easily say is that the Islamic militants are being used. They are an arm of American-Israeli foreign policy. So they can be easily classified as Israeli-American agents, because they're doing the work of America and the United States. They're doing the work of America and Israel. So they are fundamentally this. And so what happens is that when we come back, we're going to take a look at some of the unfortunate side of things and things that we need to be dealing with, because there are things that are going on that are horrible and that need to be the attention needs to be paid to them, and we need to continue on with our discussion on sex slaves and rape and war, because this is all part of it. If we want to resolve things, we have to look at them. We can't ignore them, and we need to not do what the mainstream media does: pick on something for a bit, and then lose interest and walk on to do something else, and then eventually, every once in a while, come back and pick up things as our ratings need to. So we're going to continue on with our thing. We're going to look at this this whole issue of morality in war and morality in society, because that's this main topic here. That's what we go back to. We're going to take a look at that in a more in-depth in our last section here.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Alrighty, welcome back. We had a few seconds there to relax. This is our last segment for this edition, and as I said before, we need to talk about the unpleasant side, the more unpleasant side of the wars, and it does fall. Everything falls back to morality. Everything sits within the context of morality, and morality itself sits in the context of theology. But we're not ready to go exactly to theology yet. We still have to do more work in morality. And the thing is, we're going to take a look at rape and war, and also we're going to take a look at sexual slavery. And because a number of things have come up in the news recently that that sort of warrants our looking at this. And the thing is that in Ukraine itself, we're seeing what's going on in Ukraine. What's going on in Ukraine, and actually even in Syria, is reminiscent of what happened in Yugoslavia, where the European Union fostered a breakup and a regime change in Yugoslavia. They're doing the same thing they're doing the same thing in Ukraine. They're doing the same thing in Syria. They're breaking it up. They're supporting multiple different groups. They have the Kurds. They have ISIS. They have a lot of. In other words, they're breaking these regions up into smaller regions that can be easily controlled by. Well, they think can be easily controlled by the United States and the EU. But the thing is, all you have to do is take a look at Africa, because the same policy was enacted in Africa. If you wonder why Africa is such a mess, because the same policies that are going on in Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, are also going on in Africa. The same policy that created Yugoslavia and the breakup and the mess we saw in Kosovo, in Bosnia, and all these massacres. This same policy has been applied in Africa. In other words, it's the same policy, it's the same thing. Break up these countries, make sure they're small enough that they can't survive on their own, that they require a EU master. In other words, it's still European colonialism, white mastership, without the name being, without saying, we are white supremacists. In other words, the white supremacy is there without the title. So this is Europe flexing its empire muscle, still trying to control the world, but it's trying to do it by destroying everything around it. And as it destroys everything around it, it picks up whatever is left over. And this can actually be seen in the this whole narrative in terms of the evil that's going on inside the European governments, the Western governments, including the United States, with the CIA torture report. And the thing is, the CIA torture report, everybody knew what was going on. No one was surprised by this, really. People go, oh yeah, they made the comments in there. But if you know geopolitics, if you've been watching what's going on and following what's going on in the geopolitical realm, this includes Alex Jones, this includes Young Turks, left and right fringe groups in terms of fringe media. Everybody knew what was going on. No one was surprised by this report. But yet you see in the public face the falseness, the lies continue on. They don't come up and say they talk about the truth. You have, and this is the cool part. This is actually how you pick apart these conspiracies. You pick apart the conspiracy because you have Dick Cheney here, who is now on another side of the political thing, coming up and blaming Bush and saying, "Oh yeah, Bush knew all of that." So what's happening here is people are getting caught, the lights being shined on them, and they're all starting to rat each other out now. And so as each side rats each other out, you start watching both sides, you start looking at all the different reports they're putting out, and you start picking together and piecing together what actually occurred. And you realize that all these people were involved. It wasn't one person or that person. They were all involved. They all knew what was going on. This includes the Democrats, and the Democrats knew what was going on as well. This wasn't something that was a secret. This something was what we call an open secret. Everybody knew what the secret was, just nobody was talking about it. And this is sort of the same thing as you sort of look at and see what was happening with ISIS and how they've got the sex slaves now in ISIS and how they've beheaded 4 Christian children. They're starting to behead more people now. These things, if you look into history, they're known. these things are not unusual things. And I said, if you look around to India, you see, beheading for children in Iraq for not refusing to convert to Islam. What a horrible thing. Well, you see this in India when we talk about the Hindu-Muslim couple who were killed by their own family because the father, the husband wasn't Muslim. So you had a Muslim person, a Muslim woman, marrying a Hindu man. This was unacceptable to the Muslims, and the Muslims killed them. And this is the family. And I said that the kicker of the argument, the whole thing that sort of sets this in place, is the last line. It says, "This is the 5th incident of honor killing in a week in this region." In other words, what goes on, that Muslim honor killing in India, is a regular occurrence. It's a daily occurrence, right? 5th incident in a week, 5 days, 5 incidents in a 7-day week. That's almost daily. And so there's no need, when you see this, you go back and say, and ask yourself the question, is what ISIS is doing unusual? The answer is no, because you see it right here. But how many people are going to go out and actually do this sort of investigation? And the thing is, we look around and say, everyone says in the news, you see this in the news, how horrible all this work is here, right? What's happening? The sort of what's going on in ISIS with the beheadings, with the rapes, and so on and so forth. And you go and take a look and see what's going on in Europe and in Canada. Recently in Canada, and I disagree with this law, and I'll explain why I disagree with the law. In Canada, the Harper government, he's on the social right, he's on the Nazi side of things. And again, I support the conservatives here because they do exactly what the Republicans do. They keep government small, and because the government's small and they don't have a lot of resources to do things, they keep out of your life. And so, as an individual, I am more free to do things than I am with the social left government. So, if I want to be more free and work towards my own things, then I choose a conservative government, even though I don't agree with what they're doing, because it allows me to do more on my own. Whereas a social left government, I'm always battling the government, because the government is always omnipresent. They have high taxes. They're always out. They're the bully you can't. In terms of bullying, the social left is the bully you can't get away from. The social right is the bully you can get away from. So in terms of bullies, I'd rather have the bully on the right that I can get away from than the bully on the left that I can't get away from. And the thing is, they talk about Bill C-36, which recriminalizes prostitution. Now, the thing is, this is the opposition to this bill is coming from a social left group, the Sex Professionals of Canada. There's a number of groups, organizations that are like this, that support prostitution. But the problem is here is I don't necessarily support prostitution. I don't think it should be criminal, but at the same time I don't support prostitution. And why? They argue that there is no moral issue, that this whole thing of morality is outdated. Okay, let's take that argument. Has anyone else done this before? Has anyone else gone down this path? Well, yes, India and Sweden have. What has been the result? In India, recently we've had the issues of the Uber cab driver rapes. In other words, they're now as they're doing the research into the Uber cab driver rape, they find this guy has been a multiple rapist. That multiple women have complained, and that although India has now come up with stricter laws on rape, and now more women are actually reporting rape, and this, you can see this in India in the Indian Times, in Indian media, you see this report of rape more often. The number of rapes have not gone down. Matter of fact, the number of rapes have gone up. And why? Because the morality issue has never been addressed. And we'll go and show this. And I think the same thing in Sweden. Sweden and Scandinavia, they have very tough rape laws. But what's happened? And they also have the prostitution laws, and then the same thing in India. The prostitution laws in India are accepted because there are Hindu beliefs that prostitution is sacred. In other words, India has a cult of prostitution. They have a goddess for prostitution. And in Sweden, they have no god. They're now atheists. And so there is no morality, and there's no moral issue with prostitution. They say, well, they're just simply sex workers. This is employment. What has happened in both cases? You go in Delhi and you go into Sweden and the Scandinavian areas. You see that the use of sexual slaves have gone up. In other words, you want to find out where the sexual slaves are being trafficked to from Russia and from the eastern part of Europe. They're going to Scandinavia. They're going to Germany. They're going to Italy. All these areas with these open sexual laws, that's where they're going to. In other words, the demand for sexual slaves in these areas, and these are reports from the groups who are working with sexual slaves to get them out of these places. They're trying to get them out of these places. The reports and the studies that are being done by these groups are showing an increase, that these open sexual laws, the open prostitution laws, have increased the number of sexual slaves, not decreased it. And so what we're going to expect here in Canada, in Ontario, and this is actually what we're kind of seeing, is that we're seeing more prostitution, we're seeing more child prostitution, we're seeing more sexual slavery here in Canada, in Ontario, not less. And so, yes, and the thing is, if you look, and I said before, you look at what a sex worker is, what a prostitute is. They're slaves. There is no choice here. No one grows up and saying, I want to be a prostitute. No one grows up to do that. This is something they're surviving at. This is because they have no other options. If you don't have another option out, or you don't have any other options anyways, then it's not a choice. You're not choosing prostitution. And in many ways, they're victims, they're slaves. So why criminalize the victim? If you want to go after the criminal here, go after the criminal. Go after the person who's doing the abuse. Go after the abuser. But this isn't happening here because why? Who are the abusers? In many cases, they're politicians, they're police. They're part of the establishment. So they can never go on and say, oh, we're going to go after the abuser. Because why? They have to start going after themselves. And that has never happened. This was actually demonstrated in the Stanford University experiment done by Dr. Philip Zimbardo. The police in the experiment, the guards in the experiment, didn't go after themselves. The warden, because this is Dr. Philip Zimbardo, didn't go after himself. He didn't blame himself. Somebody had to come from the outside and say, hey, wait a minute, look what's going on. And unless somebody comes from the outside and says, hey, and stops this, it's not going to stop because they're not looking at the morality of this thing here. They're not looking at, the real cause of the problem. And until you deal with the root cause of the problem, then you're not going to deal with the problem itself, and it's going to continue on, and it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And this is what we see historically. And so the thing is, yes, I oppose Bill C-36, but at the same time, I oppose the open models proposed by the Sex Professionals of Canada. And this is an actual organization. You can go check out their website. It's I think it's spoc.ca. That's their website. Go check them out, and you'll see what I'm talking here. You do have to go back and do some research here. And the thing is, with the whole issue here is, you have to look at morality. You can't simply look at, oh well, what's legal and not legal, because morality does seem to matter here. Morality, and the thing is not all moralities are created equal. It's not that there are multiple moralities. There isn't multiple moralities. We're starting to see here that there is a single morality, and that once we have the single morality, then you're going to have to start conforming to it. Otherwise, you're going to have these particular problems. And the thing is what's happening in Sweden is what I said before, is you have these teachers, and this is part of the teachers union, and this is part of the system, educating kids, sexualizing kids from the age of 7 years old. The head teacher, Kirsten Sonfors, and she says sex education in Sweden has been an obligatory subject introduced to children from 7 years old. In other words, they start sexualizing the kids from 7. By the time they get old enough, rape is no longer an issue. They're expected to simply brush it off, and they do. And the thing is that You see the same thing in India, and then in terms of the abortion story. Because abortion and sexuality wasn't an issue, the parents never reported it. And this is where you had the girl dying after 3 abortions. And the problem was, again, this whole morality thing. The door of morality was open, and the incident walked in. Right? The rape and the abortions happened. And there was no issue because the parents simply didn't want to report it because they were too afraid to. As they were arguing, it wasn't within their necessarily their concern. It was afterwards that they were concerned. After the daughter had died, they were concerned. The Uber cab driver rape in India, and now there's multiple victims coming forward. Not just first there was one victim came forward. Now there's multiple victims coming forward, and I said there's a lot more going on here. But I said it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed at all for these women at all in here. And so far now, this is the report that came out just this week, the end of the week, that the guy has been accused so far of 6 rapes. And that he's even been in jail before. But he was in jail for like a couple months. And then let go again. And the thing is, again, these things boil down to morality. And yes, you can have your reporting. Yes, you can have your strict laws. But unless the morality is there, nothing changes. And so this is where we're going to go on. We're going to look at, in our documentaries, we're going to have now documentaries coming up. In Insta-Vlogs, there will be a new part of Insta-Vlogs called iNN Vlogs. These will be the beginnings of documentaries. And we will work our way from essays into the full documentaries. And we're going to continue on. We're going to look at this week after week, episode after episode, edition after edition. We're going to keep looking at this. We're going to look at the problem. We're going to pick it apart. And we're going to show and demonstrate that morality does matter and that there is not multiple moralities, but a single morality that can be observed. Anyways, that's it for this week's edition. I will see you for the next edition. That will be on Tuesday. That will be week 50. It will be week 51.1 on Tuesday. That will be the next edition for iNN's Headlines and Beyond. Anyways, my name is Dr. Daniel Karras. I'll see you then. All right, take it easy and goodbye.
Welcome to the library, and I am the librarian.
I am the professor. And professor of what? Professor of physics.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
Free speech rules here at Democratic Earth.